Uganda, in the years following its independence from British colonial rule in 1962, was a nation delicately balanced on the fault lines of history, ethnicity, and ambition. The euphoria of sovereignty masked the fragility of its institutions and the unresolved tensions left by decades of foreign administration. Colonial authorities had deliberately structured the territory not as a single cohesive entity, but as a patchwork of kingdoms, chiefdoms, and districts, each with its own hierarchy, loyalties, and grievances. The result was a nation where identity and allegiance were fragmented, and where political authority was never truly centralized. This was a society in which power could be wielded not solely through law or popular consent, but through patronage, force, and personal networks. The stage was set for leaders who understood the latent volatility of these divisions, and among those quietly rising to prominence was a man who would soon become synonymous with the very instability he exploited: Idi Amin. Amin's early life remains partially obscured by myth and the inconsistencies of colonial records, but certain truths emerge with clarity. He was born in 1925 in Koboko, a remote town near the borders of Sudan and the Belgian Congo, an area marked by ethnic complexity and the cross-currents of colonial influence. His father was a sub-chief of the Kakwa people, one of the smaller ethnic groups in northern Uganda, whose authority depended as much on local alliances as on recognition from colonial administrators. Amin himself grew up at the intersection of these competing loyalties. From an early age, he learned to navigate hierarchies of power where authority was fragile and often negotiated rather than imposed. He was not naturally drawn to politics in the conventional sense, but to the structures of power and control, to the ways men could bend circumstances to their will. The young Amin joined the British colonial army as a private in the late 1940s, a decision that would prove pivotal not only for his personal trajectory, but for Uganda's post-colonial history. Military service offered him a rare avenue for mobility, prestige, and influence. In the army, he demonstrated a combination of physical strength, discipline, and shrewdness, earning promotions at a pace that surprised even his superiors. It was not ideology that guided his ascent. It was proximity, timing, and the understanding that loyalty in the army could translate into leverage in the broader political arena. As the colonial powers gradually prepared for withdrawal, Amin had positioned himself at the center of the one institution in Uganda that would remain cohesive in the immediate aftermath: the military. During the early years of independence, the Ugandan army was a crucible in which the country's latent tensions were magnified. Recruits were drawn disproportionately from certain regions and ethnic groups, often reflecting the preferences of colonial officers who favored perceived reliability over equality. The army became less a national institution and more a collection of factions, each loyal to commanders whose authority derived from personal charisma or control over patronage, rather than from law or national sentiment. Amin navigated this environment with a careful mixture of tact and opportunism. He avoided overt political entanglements while building networks of loyalty within the officer corps. Others in the army were focused on immediate survival, political advancement, or the pursuit of personal gain, but Amin appeared to understand that patience, strategic alignment, and an eye for weakness could yield far greater dividends in the long term. The political landscape outside the barracks was equally complex. Milton Obote, Uganda's first prime minister and later president, sought to create a semblance of national cohesion by centralizing authority and curbing the influence of regional kingdoms. Obote's efforts were hampered by the very divisions he aimed to resolve. Ethnic rivalries, historical grievances, and regional loyalties proved resistant to the imposition of a uniform state structure. For a man like Amin, this political environment was a lesson in opportunity. He observed the vulnerabilities of civilian leadership, the limitations of party politics, and the ways in which state authority could be undermined not through grand conspiracies, but through simple misalignment, mismanagement, and reliance on fragile coalitions. He recognized that the machinery of government could be more fragile than the machinery of force, and he positioned himself to exploit that disparity. By the late 1960s, Amin had become a prominent figure within the Ugandan army, commanding respect and fear simultaneously. Unlike politicians who relied on rhetoric and legislative maneuvering, he relied on presence, discipline, and the implicit threat of violence. Officers and soldiers who sought advancement learned that their fortunes depended on aligning with him, directly or indirectly. His influence was magnified by his ability to act decisively where others hesitated. Decisions that might have paralyzed other officers were met by Amin with instinctive authority. This decisiveness, coupled with his growing network of loyalists, set the stage for a sudden and dramatic intervention in Uganda's political life, a moment that would transform him from a powerful military figure into the central authority of the state itself. Yet Amin's rise cannot be understood solely in terms of personal ambition or opportunism. It was facilitated by the fragility of Uganda's post-colonial structures and the miscalculations of those around him. Obote's government, though nominally in control, was plagued by insecurity, factionalism, and over-reliance on ethnic loyalty. The military, once a tool of stabilization, had become a political actor in its own right, and Amin was positioned at its center. His understanding of these dynamics was not theoretical. It was practical, born of years spent observing the ebb and flow of authority, of understanding which levers of power could be pulled, and which alliances could be counted on in moments of crisis. The early perception of Amin among the public and within military circles was paradoxical. He was both charismatic and terrifying, capable of inspiring loyalty, and yet feared for his unpredictability. His presence suggested order in a chaotic system, but the very mechanisms through which he exerted control, fear, loyalty, and the centralization of authority, contained the seeds of instability. In many ways, Amin embodied the contradictions of Uganda itself, a nation seeking cohesion but fractured by history, aspiring to sovereignty but vulnerable to the ambitions of those who understood how to manipulate its weaknesses. It is important to recognize that Amin's early consolidation of influence was not accompanied by overt cruelty or public brutality. At this stage, his power was subtle, exercised in the corridors of the barracks and through the silent alignment of officers and subordinates. What would later become a hallmark of his regime, the arbitrary use of violence, the personalization of state power, and the climate of terror, was still latent. The groundwork was being laid not through overt repression, but through strategic patience, the cultivation of loyalty, and the careful exploitation of institutional fragility. Amin's genius, in this context, was his ability to understand the slow, cumulative nature of power, to see how small advantages, nurtured over time, could compound into decisive leverage. By the time the early 1970s approached, Amin's position was nearly unassailable within the military hierarchy. He had cultivated alliances across ethnic and regional lines, ensured loyalty among key units, and observed the weaknesses of civilian authority with the meticulous attention of a tactician. The broader political landscape remained volatile, but within the microcosm of the army, Amin had created a network of influence that allowed him to act with extraordinary autonomy. He had effectively become the power behind the throne, a figure whose authority, though unofficial, was recognized by peers, subordinates, and, to some extent, by the government itself. In examining this period, it becomes clear that Amin's rise was not an abrupt historical anomaly, but the logical outcome of the conditions around him. A fragmented society, fragile institutions, and a politicized military created the circumstances in which a single, decisive actor could reshape the trajectory of the state. Amin's personal qualities, his patience, his decisiveness, his understanding of loyalty and fear, interacted with these structural factors in a way that made the eventual seizure of power appear almost inevitable in retrospect. He did not act in isolation. He acted as the most capable and prepared actor within a system predisposed to collapse from within. This formative period also reveals something essential about Amin's character: his ability to operate in the shadows, to wield influence quietly and efficiently, and to prepare for moments when decisive action could convert latent power into overt authority. His early career was marked not by grandiose displays, but by strategic accumulation of advantage, a careful reading of context, and an uncanny sense of timing. Understanding this early stage is crucial because it illuminates the roots of his later governance style, the instinctual, personalized, and often brutal exercise of power that would define Uganda for nearly a decade. By tracing Amin's journey from a loyal soldier to the central figure poised to seize national authority, we see the interplay of personal ambition and structural fragility. We see a man shaped by his environment, but also shaping it in turn. And in this interplay lies the first lesson of his rise. In a state where institutions are weak, the ambitions of a single individual, coupled with strategic patience and an understanding of power, can transform history. Amin's early years were not marked by spectacle or notoriety, but by preparation, observation, and the quiet accumulation of leverage, the prelude to a dramatic, consequential, and ultimately devastating chapter in Uganda's history. In the years following independence, the Ugandan military was less a national institution than a microcosm of the country's fragile political and social structures. The army was both a reflection of Uganda's post-colonial ambitions and a symptom of its weaknesses, caught between the need to maintain order and the pressures of political factionalism, ethnic divisions, and personal loyalties. While the civilian government under Milton Obote sought to consolidate authority and build national cohesion, the army operated with a degree of autonomy that would soon make it a decisive player in Uganda's trajectory. This autonomy was not accidental. It was the product of deliberate colonial-era recruitment patterns, regional favoritism, and the inherent difficulties of managing a newly independent state with a deeply fragmented population. Recruitment practices during this period created a military that was deeply unbalanced in terms of ethnic representation. Certain groups, perceived as more loyal or capable, were favored for officer positions, while others were marginalized or confined to the lower ranks. These imbalances created informal networks of loyalty within the army that were often stronger than allegiance to the state itself. Commanders who understood these dynamics could leverage them to consolidate personal power, while the civilian government struggled to assert authority over a body that had become politically conscious and institutionally independent. For Idi Amin, who had already established himself as a rising force within the officer corps, this structure offered both opportunity and protection. The military was not just a career path. It was a platform from which influence could be projected far beyond the barracks. Amin's rise was facilitated by a combination of personal skill, strategic alliances, and an acute understanding of the army's internal dynamics. He cultivated loyalty through patronage, offering promotions and favors to those who aligned with him, while quietly sidelining or intimidating those who resisted. Unlike civilian politicians, whose power depended on elections, public opinion, or parliamentary maneuvering, Amin's authority depended on direct control over armed men, a form of leverage that could never be easily contested. He moved with an instinctive awareness of timing, knowing when to act decisively and when to remain in the background, allowing circumstances to strengthen his position without exposing himself to unnecessary risk. By the mid-1960s, the military had become a central pillar of Uganda's power structure, not merely a tool of the state. The army's increasing influence was both a symptom of and a response to the weaknesses of civilian governance. Corruption, factionalism, and ethnic favoritism eroded Obote's legitimacy, and the military, disciplined, cohesive, and armed, filled the vacuum. Officers like Amin learned to navigate this duality, outwardly loyal to the government, yet increasingly autonomous, capable of shaping outcomes in ways that were invisible to civilian leaders. The military was becoming a state within a state, a pattern seen in many post-colonial nations where institutions inherited from colonial regimes were structurally inadequate for the challenges of independence. Within this environment, Amin demonstrated an extraordinary capacity for observation and calculation. He paid careful attention to the loyalties of subordinates, the ambitions of peers, and the weaknesses of superiors. He recognized that authority in the army was as much about perception as it was about formal rank. An officer who could inspire fear, respect, or admiration among colleagues could wield influence far beyond the nominal responsibilities of his post. Amin understood this principle instinctively. He cultivated an image of decisive competence, physical strength, and ruthlessness, while maintaining a careful distance from actions that might compromise his long-term ambitions. In doing so, he became a figure whose influence exceeded his formal title, a pivot point around which the fate of the army, and ultimately the nation, would turn. The army itself was transforming during this period. It expanded in size, absorbed new recruits from diverse regions, and increasingly relied on foreign training programs, particularly in Britain and Israel. These programs offered technical skills and tactical expertise, but they also reinforced Amin's emerging networks of loyalty. Officers who had trained abroad returned with enhanced prestige, and Amin was able to position himself as both a peer and a mentor, consolidating influence over a new generation of military leaders. The army's growth was thus not merely quantitative. It was qualitative, altering the balance of power within Uganda's ruling elite and providing Amin with the tools he needed to assert control when the moment arrived. The institutional culture of the army was equally significant. It was a hierarchy in which obedience was demanded, but personal relationships determined career trajectories. Discipline was enforced, but loyalty was transactional, dependent on the ability to navigate internal politics and secure advantages for oneself and one's allies. Amin's mastery of this culture allowed him to dominate not through ideology or charisma alone, but through a pragmatic understanding of human behavior, incentives, and fear. He recognized that power in a fragile state did not reside in laws, constitutions, or formal authority. It resided in the ability to command men who were themselves instruments of coercion and control. As Amin's influence grew, so too did the centralization of authority around his person. Decisions that once passed through committees, councils, or political channels increasingly became matters of personal judgment. Policy, promotions, and military operations were all filtered through the lens of his discretion. This centralization had immediate practical benefits. It allowed for rapid action, minimized bureaucratic delays, and created the appearance of decisiveness. It also sowed the seeds of instability. Institutions that were meant to mediate, check, or balance power were bypassed or weakened, and the state's resilience depended increasingly on the temperament and judgment of a single man. By the late 1960s, it was clear to observers within Uganda that the army was no longer merely a defensive force. It was a political actor capable of shaping the nation's future. The balance of power between the military and the civilian government was shifting, and Amin was positioned to exploit this shift. His relationships with key officers, his understanding of the army's internal dynamics, and his ability to project authority without exposing vulnerability made him a decisive figure in a system increasingly governed by coercion and personal loyalty rather than law or consensus. The stage was being set for a dramatic reordering of power, one in which the military would move from the background to the center of political life. The broader social context reinforced the army's importance. Uganda was a country marked by regional disparities, economic challenges, and ethnic tensions. Civilian institutions, already weak, struggled to provide services, maintain security, or command legitimacy. In such an environment, the army became both a stabilizing and destabilizing force. Its presence reassured some citizens while intimidating others. Its actions could enforce order but also exacerbate divisions. Amin's role was to navigate this duality, positioning himself as both protector and arbiter, while gradually consolidating authority in his own hands. This process required patience, calculation, and an unerring sense of timing, a combination that would define his later rule. It is also important to note that Amin's ascent was not predicated on ideology or public popularity. He did not campaign, write, or appeal to national sentiment. His influence was cultivated through observation, relationships, and the strategic use of power. This approach allowed him to remain flexible, adaptive, and unencumbered by the constraints of political doctrine or partisan loyalty. It also made his eventual seizure of power all the more sudden and dramatic, even though the conditions that enabled it had been building for years. By the end of this period, the army had become an institution defined less by its formal hierarchy and mission than by the personal networks of power that Amin had cultivated. Loyalty, fear, and patronage were the currencies of authority, and Amin had become the central banker. His position allowed him to shape decisions, influence appointments, and prepare the ground for the decisive moment when military authority would become state authority. The structures he built within the army mirrored the weaknesses of the state itself. Personal relationships mattered more than institutions, loyalty mattered more than law, and the capacity for decisive action mattered more than deliberative governance. In this environment, Amin was not merely a soldier rising through the ranks. He was a figure who understood, with extraordinary clarity, how power operated in a fragile, post-colonial state. Ultimately, the story of the Ugandan army in these years is inseparable from the story of Idi Amin. The army was a vehicle for his rise, a laboratory in which he honed his understanding of loyalty, coercion, and authority. It was both a reflection of Uganda's fragility and an instrument for reshaping it. By the time the decisive moment approached, Amin's influence within the military had grown to such an extent that the civilian government could no longer act independently. The army had become a political actor, and Amin had become its axis. His rise was not simply the result of ambition. It was the logical outcome of structural weaknesses, personal acumen, and the disciplined, patient accumulation of influence. In understanding the army and Amin's place within it, we see the preconditions for the dramatic, irrevocable shift in Uganda's political landscape that would soon unfold. By the early months of 1971, Uganda had become a nation defined by tension and fragility, a state in which political authority was tenuous, regional loyalties were powerful, and the military had emerged as the decisive force in governance. Milton Obote, the prime minister turned president, had attempted to centralize power and consolidate control over the young republic, but his efforts were unevenly implemented and fraught with resistance. Ethnic divisions, historic grievances, and the uneven distribution of resources created a context in which civilian authority was vulnerable, and the army, disciplined and cohesive, had increasingly become a parallel locus of power. In this environment, the conditions were set for a decisive intervention, one that would appear sudden to many observers, but had been years in preparation. The events leading to the coup were as much about opportunity as ambition. Obote had been away from the capital, attending a Commonwealth conference in Singapore, a circumstance that created a window of vulnerability. Within the corridors of power, rumors circulated of potential unrest, and the president's absence exposed the fragility of institutional command. Those who had long observed the shifting dynamics within the army, including Idi Amin, recognized that this was the moment when latent influence could be converted into overt authority. It was not merely a question of seizing power, but of doing so in a way that appeared swift, decisive, and ultimately inevitable to those within the state apparatus. Amin's understanding of the army's internal mechanics was critical to the success of the intervention. Over the preceding decade, he had cultivated a network of loyalty among officers and key units, positioning himself as both a respected colleague and an indispensable figure. The coup was not a chaotic scramble. It was a carefully orchestrated exercise in command and coordination. Orders were given with precision, units moved according to prearranged plans, and communication channels had been secured to prevent obstruction or betrayal. To those outside the inner circle, the operation may have seemed abrupt, but it was the culmination of years of patient preparation, observation, and strategic alignment within the military hierarchy. The initial stages of the takeover were executed with remarkable efficiency. Key government installations were occupied, communication networks were secured, and senior officers loyal to Obote were neutralized or isolated. The speed and decisiveness of these actions minimized the potential for organized resistance, demonstrating both the military's competence and Amin's ability to orchestrate complex operations. In the aftermath, the narrative presented to the public emphasized order and continuity rather than chaos and upheaval. Amin was careful to frame the takeover as a corrective measure, a necessary intervention to restore stability to a state beset by division and uncertainty. This framing would prove crucial in shaping initial public perception and consolidating early legitimacy. For many Ugandans, the coup was not experienced as a dramatic rupture, but as a shift that seemed almost natural given the preceding years of political instability. The civilian government had already been weakened by corruption, factionalism, and mistrust, and the army had increasingly asserted itself as a central institution. Amin's assumption of power, executed with precision and minimal immediate violence, appeared to some as a restoration of order rather than an overthrow. Yet beneath this veneer of legitimacy, the mechanisms of authority were being restructured in ways that would soon have profound consequences for governance, civil society, and the balance of power within the nation. Amin's approach to consolidating power in the immediate aftermath of the coup was multifaceted. On one level, he emphasized public gestures designed to reassure citizens, projecting an image of calm and competence. Political prisoners were released, signaling a departure from the repressive practices associated with the previous administration. Public appearances highlighted his role as a unifying figure, one who could navigate the nation's divisions with strength and impartiality. These measures were as much about optics as substance, intended to stabilize the public perception of authority while Amin moved to secure the underlying levers of power. Beneath the surface, however, the consolidation of authority was far from benign. Amin quickly established control over key ministries, intelligence services, and security forces, ensuring that the apparatus of the state responded directly to his commands. Decisions that had previously been mediated through bureaucratic channels were centralized, and the structures of accountability that had existed, however imperfectly, were bypassed. The speed with which authority was concentrated in the hands of a single individual reflected both Amin's understanding of institutional weakness and his recognition that power, once seized, required swift reinforcement to prevent challenges or reversals. The coup also revealed the fragility of Uganda's civilian institutions. Political parties, legislative bodies, and regional administrations were largely powerless to resist or influence the outcome. The state's authority rested increasingly on the capacity to enforce decisions through military means rather than consensus or law. This dynamic would become a defining characteristic of Amin's rule, a system in which personal loyalty, fear, and coercion replaced institutions as the primary mechanisms of governance. The immediate success of the coup demonstrated not only Amin's strategic acumen, but also the extent to which Uganda's post-colonial structures were unprepared to contain the ambitions of a determined actor operating within the military hierarchy. Ethnic and regional dynamics played a subtle but significant role in the events of the coup. Amin, himself a member of the Kakwa ethnic group from the northwestern border region, understood how to navigate alliances across tribal lines while leveraging the loyalty of those closest to him. The army, already divided along ethnic lines due to recruitment patterns and historical grievances, became both a tool and a constraint. Amin's ability to act decisively depended on neutralizing potential sources of resistance, while ensuring that key units and commanders were aligned with his objectives. In this context, the coup was as much a demonstration of political intelligence as it was a military maneuver, requiring a nuanced understanding of the intersecting loyalties that shaped the state. The psychological impact of the coup was immediate and profound. For observers within Uganda and abroad, the rapid change of leadership highlighted the fragility of the state and the centrality of the military in political life. Citizens who had already been accustomed to periods of uncertainty and tension now faced a new reality. The authority of the state could be overturned swiftly, and the mechanisms for challenging such a transformation were limited. This perception of instability, reinforced by Amin's personal charisma and the visible power of the military, would shape both domestic behavior and international relations in the months and years to come. Despite the apparent efficiency of the operation, the coup also contained the seeds of future instability. The concentration of power in Amin's hands, while providing immediate control, eliminated many of the checks and balances that had previously constrained decision-making. Political debate, institutional oversight, and regional negotiation were all weakened or rendered irrelevant. In place of structured governance, authority became a function of proximity, loyalty, and the capacity for coercion. This shift would have long-term consequences, as the mechanisms that could have moderated excess, enforced accountability, or mediated conflict were effectively removed from the equation. The narrative surrounding Amin's takeover was carefully curated to emphasize legality, order, and the restoration of stability. Public addresses framed the coup as a response to perceived mismanagement and corruption under Obote, portraying Amin as a corrective figure rather than a disruptor. Media outlets, limited in their independence and often reliant on state resources, echoed this framing, reinforcing the perception that the intervention was both necessary and legitimate. This construction of narrative authority allowed Amin to consolidate support among those who might have been skeptical or ambivalent, ensuring that resistance remained minimal and that the early phase of his rule was marked more by acquiescence than by overt challenge. Within the military, Amin's leadership style became immediately apparent. He emphasized discipline, loyalty, and efficiency, projecting an image of decisive competence that reinforced his authority. Yet this style also introduced elements of unpredictability. Decisions were centralized, and authority was exercised according to Amin's judgment rather than established procedure. Subordinates learned quickly that obedience was paramount, that deviation could result in severe consequences, and that the mechanisms of reward and punishment were tightly controlled. The military, which had already become a political actor, now operated under a regime in which personal loyalty to the commander was paramount, creating a structure in which fear and allegiance were inseparable. The coup of 1971 thus stands as both a pivotal moment in Ugandan history and a reflection of long-term structural conditions. It was sudden in execution, but inevitable in context, the product of years of strategic positioning, observation, and exploitation of institutional weaknesses. Amin's rise was facilitated by the fragility of civilian authority, the political autonomy of the military, and the complex interplay of ethnic and regional dynamics. It demonstrated how power in a fragile state could be seized decisively by an actor who understood the levers of influence, the psychology of loyalty, and the vulnerabilities of institutions. In the months that followed, the immediate focus was on stabilization, consolidation, and the projection of authority. Amin's assumption of power marked the end of one political era and the beginning of another, one in which the centralization of power, the subordination of institutions, and the personalization of authority would define governance. The coup was not merely a military operation. It was a turning point in the nation's political trajectory, revealing both the possibilities and dangers inherent in a state where loyalty to a single individual could outweigh law, procedure, or collective governance. Ultimately, the coup exemplified the intersection of personal ambition and structural fragility. Amin did not create the conditions that allowed for the seizure of power, but he understood them with remarkable clarity and acted decisively when opportunity arose. The speed and efficiency of the takeover masked the complexity of preparation and the subtle manipulations that had preceded it. In retrospect, the events of early 1971 appear as both a sudden rupture and the culmination of a long, patient strategy, a moment when the accumulated weaknesses of the state, the loyalty of the military, and the ambition of a single man converged to reshape Uganda irrevocably. In the immediate aftermath of the coup, Uganda's political landscape seemed to settle into a curious mix of continuity and transformation. The sudden removal of Milton Obote could have been interpreted as a rupture, a violent overturning of the nation's trajectory, but Amin's early approach was far more subtle than sheer force alone. Publicly, the new leader presented himself as a restorer of order, a figure capable of navigating the divisions that had long fragmented the country. Political prisoners were released. The media conveyed messages of calm, and officials who remained in government were urged to cooperate. Amin's initial gestures were carefully calibrated to project reassurance, offering Ugandans a semblance of stability in a period that could easily have descended into chaos. This delicate balancing act was designed to foster legitimacy, to encourage acquiescence, and to mask the extraordinary centralization of power occurring behind the scenes. Amin's popularity during these early months was, in many ways, a product of perception rather than policy. He did not yet wield the full instruments of state terror that would later define his regime. Instead, he relied on appearances, public gestures, and the orchestration of ceremonies to cultivate an image of benevolent authority. Crowds cheered his presence, newspapers described his decisiveness, and international observers initially framed his rise as a pragmatic solution to political instability. In this carefully managed environment, Amin's charisma was amplified, not through conventional political skill, but through his control over the military and his ability to position himself as the arbiter of order in a nation accustomed to uncertainty. Early on, the line between reassurance and intimidation was thin, but Amin understood the psychological terrain. He could consolidate power as much through the promise of stability as through the threat of disruption. Behind this veneer, the machinery of governance was undergoing a profound transformation. Ministries that had once operated with relative autonomy were gradually subordinated to Amin's direct oversight. Decision-making became increasingly centralized, and policy was increasingly filtered through the lens of personal discretion. Bureaucrats and ministers were compelled to navigate a new hierarchy in which loyalty to the individual ruler mattered more than competence or institutional norms. Amin's approach was pragmatic and opportunistic. Those who demonstrated allegiance were rewarded with positions or privileges, while those who resisted or hesitated risked demotion, dismissal, or worse. In this environment, authority became increasingly personal, and the structures that had mediated governance under Obote were weakened or rendered irrelevant. The early months of Amin's rule also revealed a nuanced understanding of public psychology. He recognized that appearances of decisiveness and control could produce both support and compliance. He engaged in symbolic acts, such as public inspections, ceremonial speeches, and visits to local communities, creating the impression of attentiveness and benevolence. These gestures were carefully choreographed to reinforce his authority without requiring immediate structural reform or legislative action. In this sense, Amin's early rule resembled a performance of power. The theater of authority was as important as its practical application, and the cultivation of public perception became a critical instrument in consolidating control. Simultaneously, Amin's influence within the military was further strengthened. Units were reoriented to answer directly to him. Key officers were promoted based on loyalty rather than merit, and the internal networks of command were adjusted to ensure that opposition could be detected and neutralized swiftly. The army, which had already served as the instrument of the coup, became the foundation of Amin's ongoing authority. Its loyalty provided him with both security and leverage. While civilian institutions could be uncertain or ineffective, the military could enforce decisions, intimidate rivals, and serve as the visible symbol of power in a country where the legitimacy of the state was fragile. The consolidation of power was also marked by a subtle manipulation of ethnic and regional dynamics. Amin, himself a member of the Kakwa ethnic group, understood how to navigate the intricate web of allegiances, rivalries, and historical grievances that characterized Ugandan society. He relied on trusted allies from his own region while simultaneously cultivating relationships with officers and officials from other groups. This strategy allowed him to project inclusivity and national authority while ensuring that critical levers of enforcement and decision-making remained aligned with his personal network. The result was a complex balance in which loyalty and control were secured without provoking overt opposition in the earliest stages of his rule. Economically and socially, The country was beginning to feel the effects of the centralization. Administrative inertia increased as ministries and officials adapted to a new style of governance dominated by personal discretion rather than institutional procedure. Policy was often inconsistent, contingent upon Amin's decisions or the influence of his immediate advisors, and a lack of formal checks and balances left the state vulnerable to mismanagement. Yet during this period, these weaknesses were largely invisible to the public. Amin's early gestures of stability, coupled with his ability to project confidence and control, created a perception of order that temporarily masked the deeper institutional fragility beneath the surface. At the same time, Amin's approach to political opponents was deliberate and measured. He did not immediately unleash the widespread repression that would later define his regime. Rather, he neutralized potential threats selectively and strategically. Individuals with influence or connections to the previous administration were monitored, reassigned, or quietly sidelined, allowing Amin to consolidate power while minimizing the risk of premature backlash. This selective neutralization reinforced the perception that Amin was exercising discretion rather than tyranny, a carefully managed strategy that would provide him with a foundation for more aggressive measures in the future. The early consolidation period also illustrates the interplay between personal ambition and structural weakness. Amin's actions were made possible not merely by his own skill, but by the vulnerabilities inherent in Uganda's post-colonial state. The weakness of institutions, the politicization of the military, and a lack of robust mechanisms for accountability created an environment in which a decisive, calculating individual could reshape authority rapidly. Amin's rise thus highlights a central lesson about governance in fragile states. Where institutions are weak and power is concentrated in the hands of a few, the personal capacities of leaders can have disproportionate effects on national outcomes. In addition to governance and institutional control, Amin's early rule involved careful management of public perception and international relations. He sought to reassure foreign governments and investors that Uganda remained stable, emphasizing continuity in policy and the maintenance of order. Diplomatic messaging was designed to present Amin not as a revolutionary or radical disruptor, but as a pragmatic, competent leader capable of restoring confidence. These communications were particularly important in shaping early international assessments, influencing aid flows, trade, and diplomatic recognition. Amin recognized that legitimacy was not solely domestic. It required careful negotiation with a global audience attuned to instability in post-colonial Africa. Perhaps most importantly, Amin's early consolidation reflected a deep understanding of timing and opportunity. He moved quickly enough to establish authority, but cautiously enough to avoid provoking resistance. He balanced gestures of reassurance with subtle enforcement of loyalty, creating an environment in which compliance was voluntary in appearance but obligatory in practice. The result was a consolidation of power that appeared natural, even inevitable, a smooth transition in the public eye, yet one that fundamentally reshaped the underlying mechanics of governance. In examining this period, it becomes evident that Amin's early months in power were defined by strategic patience and psychological insight. His methods were less about overt terror than about the careful orchestration of authority, perception, and institutional realignment. By projecting competence, rewarding loyalty, managing potential threats, and centralizing decision-making, he established a foundation that would allow for the later expansion of personal power, often through more overtly coercive measures. The stage was set for a regime in which fear, loyalty, and discretion would replace formal institutions as the primary mechanisms of governance. Ultimately, the early consolidation phase illustrates the paradox of Amin's rule, a regime capable of projecting stability while simultaneously hollowing out the institutions upon which that stability depended. By relying on perception, personal networks, and the disciplined loyalty of the military, Amin created a temporary calm that obscured structural weakness. At the same time, he demonstrated an acute understanding of human behavior, institutional fragility, and the levers of power, lessons that would guide his governance in the years to come. This period, though superficially calm, was marked by profound transformation, as Uganda shifted from a state governed by law and bureaucracy to one increasingly defined by the discretion, authority, and personality of a single individual. The early months of Amin's rule, therefore, provide critical insight into the mechanics of power in a fragile state. They reveal a leader who understood both the optics and the realities of authority, who could balance reassurance with coercion, and who used timing, perception, and personal networks to consolidate control. They also reveal the fragility of Uganda's post-colonial institutions, which were unable to resist the centralizing ambitions of a determined actor within the military hierarchy. Together, these dynamics created a context in which the nation could appear orderly on the surface, while the foundations of governance were being restructured in ways that would have profound consequences for the years to come. As Idi Amin settled into power, it became increasingly evident that his approach to governance was defined less by structured policy or long-term planning than by instinct, intuition, and a deeply personal understanding of authority. Uganda's institutions, already weakened by years of political fragility and centralization under Obote, now faced a ruler whose decisions were unpredictable and often capricious. Ministries and bureaucracies, accustomed to procedural norms and hierarchical consultation, found themselves disoriented in a system where authority flowed directly from the will of the president. Amin's style was not governed by ideology or administrative precedent, but by immediate perception, intuition, and an acute, if sometimes erratic, reading of loyalty and threat. The early promise of stability gave way to uncertainty, and the mechanisms of governance shifted from formal processes to personal discretion, creating both efficiency and instability simultaneously. The unpredictability of Amin's decision-making became apparent across multiple levels of governance. Policies were enacted one day and reversed the next. Appointments were made based on personal favor rather than experience or competence. And ministers and officials learned quickly that their careers depended more on proximity to the ruler than on professional expertise. In such an environment, the bureaucracy became both anxious and pliable. Officials were forced to anticipate the whims of the president, often without guidance or precedent. Loyalty, adaptability, and the ability to interpret Amin's shifting moods became as important as technical skill, and the separation between effective governance and survival blurred. The state's functionality increasingly depended on the ability of individuals to align with a personality rather than an institution. This instinct-driven style was mirrored in Amin's interactions with the military, the institution that had facilitated his rise. Once a structured hierarchy governed by ranks, regulations, and collective planning, the army now operated under a system where personal allegiance to Amin determined authority. Promotions, assignments, and disciplinary measures were influenced less by competence and more by perception of loyalty. Officers who demonstrated initiative or independence risked reassignment or dismissal, while those who aligned unconditionally with Amin's preferences were rewarded. This system reinforced loyalty in the short term, but eroded institutional cohesion and undermined strategic planning, creating an organization capable of immediate obedience, but increasingly vulnerable to mismanagement and misjudgment. At the same time, the centralization of power allowed Amin to act decisively in ways that a more constrained system could not. Decisions that might have required debate, negotiation, or bureaucratic consultation were made swiftly, creating the appearance of efficiency and control. Amin's ability to issue rapid directives, whether in domestic policy or military matters, projected strength and decisiveness, reinforcing the perception of a ruler who was in command. Yet this very speed, rooted in intuition rather than analysis, introduced profound risk. Decisions were often inconsistent, poorly informed, or reactive, and the absence of checks on his authority meant that errors had amplified consequences. The state, once dependent on collective governance, now relied on the judgment of a single individual whose instincts could not always be predicted or rationalized. The economy was one area where Amin's instinctive governance produced particularly visible effects. Initiatives were launched impulsively, sometimes designed to reward loyalty, respond to perceived threats, or project a nationalist narrative, rather than to stabilize or grow the economy. Ministries and agencies responsible for trade, finance, and agriculture were frequently bypassed or overridden, leaving implementation inconsistent and poorly coordinated. Projects were announced publicly with fanfare, but follow-through was often uneven, leading to both public disappointment and systemic inefficiency. Citizens experienced a paradox. The government appeared active and responsive, yet the underlying structures needed to sustain policy were increasingly fragile. Amin's reliance on intuition extended into foreign policy as well. Diplomatic initiatives were sometimes unpredictable, combining gestures of engagement with dramatic, symbolic acts intended to assert personal authority rather than reflect coherent national strategy. Relations with neighboring states were punctuated by sudden announcements, shifting alliances, and an emphasis on projecting strength. While these actions often enhanced Amin's reputation domestically, they contributed to a sense of instability internationally, as foreign observers struggled to reconcile displays of assertiveness with the lack of consistent policy. The international community recognized a pattern. Uganda under Amin was unpredictable, centralized around one man, and increasingly difficult to engage with through traditional diplomatic channels. Social governance was similarly affected by this approach. Amin's instincts, informed by perceptions of loyalty and threat, guided decisions regarding the treatment of civilians, officials, and community leaders. Those perceived as potential challengers could be removed, coerced, or intimidated, while compliant actors were rewarded with favors or protection. This system created a climate in which fear and opportunism were intertwined, as individuals navigated a society in which survival depended on alignment with the ruler's perceptions. While the early months of his rule emphasized reassurance and stability, the undercurrents of intimidation and unpredictability were already reshaping social and political norms. The education and media sectors, often viewed as tools for nation-building, were also brought into this instinct-driven framework. Publications, curricula, and public messaging were subtly adjusted to reinforce the narrative of a strong, decisive leadership while minimizing criticism or independent analysis. Institutions traditionally responsible for information dissemination or civic education were increasingly subordinated to the logic of personal authority, with oversight determined less by policy or regulation than by Amin's perception of compliance and loyalty. The resulting environment reinforced a feedback loop. The population's understanding of governance was shaped by the ruler's preferences, and the state's capacity to function was shaped by the degree to which institutions could anticipate or absorb these preferences. The effects of this intuitive governance were both immediate and long-lasting. In the short term, the appearance of decisive authority helped consolidate Amin's power and maintain public order. By acting swiftly, projecting strength, and rewarding loyalty, he created a perception of competence and control. Yet in the medium and long term, the absence of institutionalized processes, clear procedures, and systemic accountability introduced vulnerabilities. Policies lacked continuity, decisions were inconsistent, and the state became increasingly dependent on the personal capacities and moods of a single individual. The gap between perception and reality widened. While Amin appeared omnipotent, the structures supporting the perception were fragile and unsustainable. Perhaps most significantly, this period illustrates the ways in which personal rule can simultaneously stabilize and destabilize a state. Amin's intuitive approach allowed him to respond rapidly to threats, project authority, and manipulate both military and civilian actors. Yet the very mechanisms that produced short-term effectiveness also created systemic fragility. By centralizing power in his own hands, bypassing institutional checks, and relying on perception rather than process, Amin transformed governance into a series of personal judgments, each carrying disproportionate consequences. The state became a reflection of the ruler's instincts, leaving it vulnerable to miscalculation, capriciousness, and internal contradiction. This instinct-driven style also intensified the role of fear and loyalty as central currencies of governance. As officials, military officers, and civilians recognized that outcomes were determined less by law, policy, or procedure than by proximity to a means judgment, behavior became increasingly shaped by anticipation of the ruler's preferences. Compliance and loyalty were incentivized, while deviation or independent initiative was punished. In this environment, institutions existed in form but not in function, and authority became inseparable from the personality of the ruler. The state's capacity to govern depended on the balance between perceived competence, fear, and personal allegiance, rather than the resilience of legal or bureaucratic structures. Culturally and psychologically, the impact of this governance style was profound. Citizens, officials, and officers adapted to the new reality in ways that reinforced the means authority while constraining independent thought and initiative. Society learned to navigate ambiguity, uncertainty, and the caprice of power. The normalization of intuitive governance, in which outcomes were contingent on the immediate perceptions of a single individual, reshaped expectations of leadership, authority, and the relationship between rulers and the ruled. This pattern of centralization, unpredictability, and reliance on instinct would come to define not only Amin's rule, but also the broader experience of Uganda during his regime. In examining this period, it becomes clear that Amin's governance by intuition was both a product of his personal characteristics and a reflection of structural weaknesses in Uganda's post-colonial state. Institutions that might have constrained decision-making, moderated excess, or enforced continuity had already been weakened, creating an environment in which personal judgment could dominate. Amin's instincts, sharpened by years of navigating military hierarchies and political fragility, became the primary mechanism of state action. The effects of this approach were immediate, dramatic, and paradoxical, capable of projecting authority, ensuring compliance, and stabilizing public perception in the short term, yet inherently unstable and vulnerable to miscalculation over time. Ultimately, this phase of Amin's rule demonstrates the complex interplay between personality, intuition, and institutional weakness. It illustrates how a leader can consolidate power, project authority, and maintain the appearance of control through instinctive decision-making, while simultaneously eroding the very structures needed to sustain governance. It highlights the paradox of intuitive leadership in a fragile state, effective in the moment, but unsustainable in the long term. In these early years, Uganda became a laboratory for personalized rule, a system in which the instincts, moods, and judgments of a single man increasingly defined the fate of the nation. The stage was set for both the immediate exercise of power and the eventual unraveling of the structures on which that power rested, foreshadowing the volatility, unpredictability, and tragedy that would come to define Amin's decade in control. As Idi Amin consolidated his personal authority, the mechanisms of control in Uganda began to shift in form and intensity. Governance by intuition and personal discretion was no longer sufficient to maintain dominance over a fractious nation. The limits of persuasion and loyalty became increasingly apparent, and Amin turned to a systematic deployment of fear to enforce compliance, deter dissent, and reinforce his centralized authority. This was not a spontaneous eruption of violence, but a carefully calibrated expansion of the instruments of repression, a transformation of the state into a network of surveillance, intimidation, and terror. The machinery of fear became both a tool of governance and a reflection of the profound fragility of Uganda's post-colonial institutions, which could no longer contain or regulate the ambitions of a single, unrestrained individual. The first step in this transformation was the rapid expansion and reorientation of Uganda's security apparatus. Military units, intelligence services, and police forces were repurposed from their conventional functions into instruments of political enforcement. Their mandate shifted from national defense or public safety to the identification, monitoring, and neutralization of potential threats to Amin's authority. Officers and agents were instructed to act decisively, often beyond formal legal frameworks, and their actions were rarely subject to oversight. In this environment, the boundaries between law enforcement, military command, and personal loyalty blurred. Authority became inseparable from proximity to Amin's favor, and the effectiveness of the security apparatus was measured less by adherence to institutional norms than by its capacity to detect, intimidate, or eliminate perceived opposition. Fear, once a latent factor in governance, became an organizing principle. Arrests, disappearances, and executions were employed not as incidental consequences of instability, but as deliberate instruments of control. Reports circulated of individuals detained without charge, subjected to brutal treatment, or vanishing entirely, leaving families uncertain and communities anxious. These actions reinforced the perception that the state was omnipresent, that resistance was futile, and that the personal authority of the ruler was absolute. The uncertainty surrounding the application of force magnified its psychological impact. Citizens and officials alike became acutely aware that any misstep, perceived disloyalty, or association with rivals could carry lethal consequences. In this climate, fear became a form of governance in itself, a mechanism through which order could be imposed without the mediation of law or institution. The military remained central to this system of fear, serving as both the enforcer and the symbol of authority. Units loyal to Amin were strategically positioned to monitor key regions, respond rapidly to unrest, and demonstrate the consequences of disobedience. Officers were trained to internalize the importance of vigilance, loyalty, and decisiveness, creating a hierarchical culture in which fear and obedience were deeply intertwined. The Army's expanded role was both practical and symbolic. It enforced decisions directly and served as a constant reminder of the reach and capacity of the ruler. By embedding fear into the structure of the military, Amin ensured that loyalty was not voluntary but compelled, that obedience was not negotiated but imposed. Intelligence services played a complementary role, operating as the eyes and ears of the regime. Networks of informants, surveillance, and interrogation allowed the government to monitor behavior, identify potential dissent, and anticipate challenges. The mere perception of scrutiny was sufficient to influence behavior, as citizens, officials, and military personnel alike adjusted their actions to avoid attracting attention. Loyalty became performative, compliance habitual, and dissent rare. In this environment, the state's authority was both pervasive and invisible, extending through networks of observation and intimidation rather than through formal law or policy. The machinery of fear was systematic, deliberate, and self-reinforcing. Amin's use of terror was also highly selective, reflecting a calculated understanding of psychology and social dynamics. Publicized arrests, executions, and displays of punishment were often accompanied by periods of apparent leniency or reward, creating an unpredictable rhythm that reinforced obedience. Individuals could be elevated or removed based on perceived loyalty, creating a climate in which anticipation and caution became essential survival skills. This unpredictability, far from undermining control, amplified it. Citizens and officials internalized the necessity of aligning with Amin's preferences, not merely to gain advantage, but to avoid catastrophe. Fear became not an occasional tool, but a constant force, shaping behavior at every level of society. The broader consequences of this approach were profound. Uganda's civil institutions, already weakened by centralization and personal rule, were further eroded. Ministries and bureaucracies became subordinate to the logic of intimidation rather than the logic of governance. Policy was increasingly implemented through the threat of force rather than reasoned debate or procedural authority. Officials learned to prioritize personal survival over professional responsibility, and competence was often secondary to loyalty and compliance. The state functioned less as a collective organization and more as an extension of Amin's will, with the machinery of fear providing both structure and enforcement. Economic and social systems were similarly affected. Businesses, local governments, and civil society were compelled to operate under the implicit understanding that failure to align with Amin's expectations could result in severe consequences. Commercial networks were disrupted by arbitrary interventions. Educational and health systems were influenced by political considerations, and the social fabric itself became a tool for monitoring loyalty and influence. Fear permeated public life, altering behavior, restricting initiative, and reinforcing dependence on the regime. The psychological impact was cumulative. The population adapted to a new normal in which obedience, vigilance, and strategic alignment became essential for survival. Internationally, reports of repression began to surface, though the regime maintained an outwardly confident posture. Diplomats, journalists, and foreign observers were confronted with accounts of disappearances, summary executions, and pervasive intimidation, yet the regime's public image emphasized stability, strength, and decisiveness. Amin's understanding of perception extended beyond domestic audiences. He was acutely aware of how the machinery of fear could be projected externally to assert authority while managing international scrutiny. This duality, the internal intensification of terror and the external projection of competence, allowed the regime to consolidate power domestically while navigating the complexities of regional and global diplomacy. The institutionalization of fear also reshaped interpersonal relationships within the state. Officers, ministers, and civil servants were compelled to negotiate relationships through the lens of survival, interpreting commands, decisions, and gestures for indications of favor or disfavor. Alliances became fragile and highly contingent, reinforcing the centrality of Amin's personal judgment. Social and professional interactions were mediated by a pervasive awareness of risk, creating a culture of caution, mistrust, and strategic compliance. In this sense, fear became not merely a tool of enforcement, but a mechanism that structured social, professional, and political life itself. The consequences for governance were paradoxical. On one hand, fear provided immediate compliance, facilitated rapid implementation of directives, and reinforced Amin's authority in a nation where institutional power had previously been fragmented. On the other hand, it eroded long-term functionality. Decision-making was centralized, professional expertise was marginalized, and the capacity for coordinated policy was diminished. The state became increasingly dependent on the presence, judgment, and control of a single individual, leaving it vulnerable to miscalculation, impulsive decisions, and systemic collapse. The machinery of fear, while effective in the short term, carried inherent instability. It could enforce obedience, but could not substitute for sustainable governance or institutional resilience. Culturally, the impact of this period was profound. Communities adapted to a landscape in which public behavior, speech, and even thought were shaped by perceived proximity to power and vulnerability to repression. The normalization of fear created a society in which survival depended on conformity, vigilance, and the careful management of relationships. Trust became scarce, initiative was constrained, and the rhythms of daily life were intertwined with the demands of a state whose authority was exercised through intimidation rather than consensus. This normalization of terror was not merely incidental. It became a defining feature of Uganda's political and social experience under Amin. By expanding the instruments of fear, Amin achieved both practical and symbolic objectives. The state became more controllable, opposition was minimized, and his personal authority was reinforced across multiple levels of governance. Yet the process also introduced structural fragility, undermining institutional capacity, marginalizing expertise, and creating a climate of unpredictability. Fear functioned as a force multiplier, extending the reach of personal authority while simultaneously eroding the very foundations of governance. The paradox of this system, effective in immediate control, destabilizing in the long term, would come to define the trajectory of Uganda under Amin, illustrating the ways in which coercion and personal rule can both consolidate and destabilize power. Ultimately, this period marks the point at which fear transformed from a latent tool into the central principle of governance. Amin's systematic use of intimidation, surveillance, and selective violence created a state in which obedience was enforced through psychological and physical means, where loyalty was measured by alignment with personal will rather than institutional norms, and where the mechanisms of authority became inseparable from the machinery of terror. Uganda's governance, economy, and society were irrevocably reshaped by this strategy, and the cumulative effects of fear would reverberate throughout the country for years to come, leaving a legacy of compliance, anxiety, and institutional weakness that would define the regime and its aftermath. As Idi Amin's rule progressed, the initial consolidation of power and the strategic use of fear gave way to a more insidious dynamic, the creeping expansion of paranoia. Where once he had relied primarily on the instruments of coercion to enforce loyalty and obedience, Amin now confronted the unsettling reality that the very networks and institutions he had created could themselves harbor threats. The same military and intelligence apparatus that had facilitated his rise also contained officers whose loyalty was conditional, factions with historical grievances, and individuals whose ambitions could rival his own. In a system where authority was intensely centralized and personal, any perception of disloyalty could become a catalyst for action, and Amin's growing suspicion transformed governance into a series of purges, recalibrations, and preemptive strikes. The machinery of fear, once outwardly directed toward the broader population, now increasingly turned inward, destabilizing the very structures that underpinned his power. Paranoia, in this context, was not irrational in the conventional sense, but functioned as a strategic extension of Amin's instinctive approach to power. Having learned that the rapid removal of Obote had succeeded due to precision, loyalty, and the exploitation of structural weakness, he began to apply similar logic to the perception of threats within his own ranks. Officers, officials, and advisors who were previously indispensable could be reinterpreted as liabilities. Factions aligned along ethnic, regional, or personal loyalties became potential sources of conspiracy. The distinction between genuine opposition and imagined danger blurred, as Amin's governing principle became the preemptive neutralization of any risk to his authority. In this environment, suspicion became a guiding force, and the regime increasingly defined itself by the eradication of potential challengers. The first manifestations of this paranoia were targeted purges within the military. High-ranking officers who had once commanded respect and loyalty were suddenly viewed through a lens of suspicion. Their accomplishments, relationships, and historical roles were reinterpreted as evidence of ambition or disloyalty. Amin's decisions, often abrupt and unexplained, destabilized the hierarchical structures of the armed forces. Promotions, demotions, and dismissals became tools of control, reinforcing loyalty through reward and fear while simultaneously generating anxiety and mistrust. Officers who had previously been secure in their positions now faced an environment in which survival required constant vigilance, compliance, and the careful navigation of shifting allegiances. The paradox was stark. The institution that had secured Amin's authority was now a source of uncertainty, eroding cohesion even as it enforced obedience. This internal purging extended beyond the military. Civilian officials, regional administrators, and ministers experienced similar pressures. Amin's suspicion was not confined to potential conspirators, but encompassed anyone whose influence or judgment might challenge his discretion. Administrators who demonstrated competence risked being perceived as independent actors. Those who cultivated networks of loyalty outside Amin's direct supervision became targets. The centralization of decision-making, coupled with the opacity of the ruler's judgment, meant that even routine governance was now permeated by fear. Individuals operated in a perpetual state of anticipation, calibrating their behavior not merely to policy requirements, but to the unpredictable whims and perceptions of the president. This heightened atmosphere of mistrust extended through every level of government, reshaping professional relationships, social interactions, and political calculation. The psychological consequences of this paranoia were profound, both for Amin and for the institutions he controlled. For Amin, constant vigilance became a necessity. Every decision, every action, every rumor was evaluated through the lens of potential threat. Loyalty was measured not only by outward obedience, but by perceived intent, requiring continuous observation and interpretation. The cognitive burden of this hypervigilance reinforced impulsive decision-making. Preemptive action against imagined threats often preceded careful deliberation. Paradoxically, the same mechanism that ensured control also amplified instability, as misjudgments, misinterpretations, and overreactions could produce cascading effects throughout the military and government. For those within the state, the stakes of survival were elevated and the margin for error narrowed to virtually nothing. The purges and eliminations carried out during this period were both functional and symbolic. Functionally, they removed individuals whose loyalty was uncertain or whose capacity to influence others posed a risk. Symbolically, they reinforced the centrality of Amin's authority. No position, accomplishment, or historical service could protect anyone from scrutiny or consequence. The message was clear to officers, ministers, and civilians alike. Ultimate power resided in the ruler's discretion, and survival depended on alignment with his perceptions and priorities. This dual purpose, practical enforcement combined with psychological demonstration, magnified the regime's control, embedding fear and uncertainty as intrinsic elements of governance. Ethnic and regional dynamics further intensified the scope of paranoia. Amin, a Kakwa from Uganda's northwest, relied on a core group of loyalists from his own community, yet the country's complex social fabric required a delicate balancing of alliances. Historical rivalries between ethnic groups, regional loyalties, and the remnants of colonial-era favoritism meant that perceived threats could emerge from multiple quarters. Officers and officials from different regions or tribes were scrutinized not only for competence or loyalty, but for the potential to mobilize alternative networks of influence. In this context, suspicion became systemic, codified through both policy and practice, and the process of governing itself became inseparable from the identification and neutralization of potential rivals. This atmosphere of internal insecurity extended to the management of intelligence and surveillance. Amin expanded the role of internal monitoring, ensuring that units within the military, security services, and civilian administration were responsible for reporting on behavior, allegiances, and networks. Informants were cultivated, and the perception of observation became nearly as potent as its reality. Officers and officials, aware that any act could be interpreted as dissent, adjusted their behavior accordingly. This constant surveillance created a feedback loop in which fear reinforced obedience, and obedience reinforced the perception of control, while simultaneously heightening anxiety, miscommunication, and the risk of overreaction. The state became a system defined as much by anticipation of threat as by the execution of policy. Paranoia also manifested in Amin's relationships with foreign powers and international actors. Diplomatic outreach, foreign visits, and aid negotiations were influenced by an acute awareness of potential betrayal, manipulation, or encirclement. Foreign officials were often assessed not only for their practical utility, but for their perceived intentions and capacity to influence domestic actors. This external dimension of suspicion mirrored internal dynamics, creating a state whose decisions were guided as much by perceived vulnerabilities as by strategic calculation. International engagement was filtered through a lens of mistrust, reinforcing the insularity of policy and amplifying the sense of unpredictability that characterized Amin's governance. The consequences of this expanding paranoia were structural as well as psychological. Decision-making became increasingly centralized and opaque, with fewer channels for consultation or mediation. Institutions that might have moderated impulses, provided analytical capacity, or enforced procedural consistency were bypassed or dismantled. The state's resilience was diminished even as its coercive capacity appeared to increase. Loyalty, fear and proximity to the ruler became the primary determinants of influence and survival, creating a system that was both immediately powerful and inherently unstable. The very tools that had allowed Amin to seize and consolidate power, the military, security services, and administrative networks, now carry the potential to destabilize his regime if they were mismanaged or if misjudgments were made in the identification of threats. Culturally and socially, the purges and internal purges reshaped interactions across the country. Communities, officials, and military personnel internalized the unpredictability of authority, adopting a posture of caution, self-monitoring, and strategic alignment. Communication, alliances, and initiative were all reframed within the context of survival. Individuals learned to navigate ambiguity, anticipate scrutiny, and manage perception, creating a social environment defined by caution and mistrust. This adaptation, while reinforcing Amin's control, also eroded the capacity for independent thought, collaboration, and institutional stability. Governance, social engagement, and professional conduct were all mediated by the logic of fear and suspicion, rather than collective interest or procedural norms. Ultimately, the expansion of paranoia marked a critical stage in Amin's regime. The consolidation of power, previously focused on loyalty, fear, and perception, now incorporated the continuous preemptive neutralization of potential internal threats. This shift intensified the centralization of authority, deepened institutional fragility, and amplified the psychological pressures on both the ruler and those around him. The internal purges demonstrated the duality of Amin's governance. The same mechanisms that enforce compliance and secure dominance also introduced instability, unpredictability, and long-term vulnerability. The regime's strength was inseparable from its precariousness, and the structures that had been built to secure power were simultaneously undermined by the pervasive anxiety and mistrust they generated. In this period, Uganda became a state defined not only by coercion and obedience, but by the psychology of suspicion itself. Amin's paranoia was not merely a personal trait, but a systemic feature of governance, shaping decision-making, institutional function, and social interaction. Fear, previously directed outward toward the population, now operated inward, destabilizing the very networks that had enabled the seizure of power. The country existed in a delicate equilibrium. Obedience was enforced, loyalty rewarded, and survival contingent on alignment with the ruler's perceptions. Yet this same system carried the seeds of unpredictability, miscalculation, and eventual crisis. The interplay of power, suspicion, and preemptive action would define the trajectory of the regime, illustrating the dangers inherent in governance centralized around the instincts and anxieties of a single, unrestrained individual.